Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Emeka Aniagolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, South Africa, the so-called Rainbow Nation, a country that was cut in half by the evil of apartheid and racism. After years of fighting segregation and oppression in solidarity with Nigeria and other African countries, Nelson Mandela leads his people to freedom and his country to democratic victory. But then comes a new fragile and dangerous moment, with the Rainbow Nation threatening to drag itself back to anarchy, torn asunder by hate and xenophobia. It's all captured in a new book that analyses the socio-politics of apartheid, post-apartheid and xenophobia in South Africa. It's titled Rainbow Nation with a question mark, and the author is my first guest today on the program in a moment. And later, another deadly day of protests against the new military rulers in Chad. At least 9 dead so far as security forces continue their violent crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrators. The former colonial power France has condemned the violence, warning that its support for the generals is conditional on national dialogue and a fully democratic process. We'll cross to N'Djamena to speak with our special correspondent. And later still, tempers are boiling over in Nigeria over mounting insecurity as fears grow following the disclosure by the governor of Niger State that Islamist militants could be just 2 hours away from the capital, Abuja. Lawmakers have demanded an urgent meeting with President Buhari and his military chiefs. We'll get reaction from civil society coming up. Now, it's a pungent history of Africa's most industrialized country, a socio-political analysis of what defined South Africa's fraught past and is threatening to determine its hopeful future. And it's all poignantly captured in a new book titled Rainbow Nation with a question mark. From the years of the anti-apartheid struggle and the battle against oppression in solidarity with many African countries, including Nigeria, to the present-day hostility to and fear of the very same Africans, now classed as strangers and foreigners in a new political environment of contemporary xenophobia. Rainbow Nation has been described as a thought-provoking work. Nigeria's former president, Olusegun Obasanjo, who wrote the foreword to the book, called it a very important piece of modern African history, judiciously recorded and preserved for posterity. Well, in a moment, we'll speak with the author of Rainbow Nation, a historical and socio-political analysis of apartheid, anti-apartheid struggle, post-apartheid conditions, and contemporary xenophobia in the Republic of South Africa. But first, here's the great Nelson Mandela speaking shortly after the end of apartheid.
The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us. We have at last achieved our political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. We commit ourselves to the construction of a complete, just, and lasting peace. We understand it still that there is no easy road to freedom. We know it well that none of us acting alone can achieve success. We must therefore act together as a united people for national reconciliation, for nation building, for the birth of a new world. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. Let freedom reign.
the great Nelson Mandela. Well, to help us reflect on the troubled history of modern South Africa, I'm joined now in the studio by Professor Emeka Aniagolu, author of Rainbow Nation, a historical and socio-political analysis of South Africa. And that is, of course, an abridged version of the title. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And this is a book that you've been working on for a while, and now it's published. It's an academic, a journalistic, and a creative passion work. Can you tell us about it?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a book that I thought was necessary because I didn't want to write a book that was so simply going to demonize South Africans for the current situation of xenophobia without taking into full account the history of what produced the conditions now, and taking into full account their own experience of suffering and what might have shaped some of the distorting psyche of people and so on and so forth. So I thought to do justice to the subject, one had to give it a panoramic view from the beginning of European arrival to the current situation. And that's what I tried to do.
Right. So what made you decide to write the book?
What made me decide to write the book was because it was obviously a very intriguing twist of circumstance that South Africans, many of whom their leaders and the comrades in the vanguard organizations were in exile in many of the African countries, particularly in the frontline states. And countries like Nigeria supporting them in the millions, if not billions of dollars, to have turned around and made total pariahs of those same people within South Africa was something intriguing to me. Like, how could this occur? And I wanted to find out what led to it and what could have caused this type of thing.
So a very short memory there.
Indeed, and the distortions of images and information or lack thereof that the vast majority of the people get. And I wanted to look at that and also inform people in the book, like I said, both South Africans and Nigerians, of what other Africans did in very specific, verifiable ways.
So the target audience for this book is clearly anyone and everyone.
Indeed.
So based on what you've seen so far, what sort of reaction has there been to your book? I know it hasn't been, I mean, you just literally published it, but you've got reviews and you've got...
Well, all the people that I have given it to read have been fascinated by it. You've mentioned the former head of state, Obasanjo, and he's a very, very scrupulous reader. So he went over it. We sat for a couple of hours in his presidential library in Abeokuta, and virtually line by line in the chapters and so on. And he was impressed with it and endorsed it and so forth. I made a point deliberately of making sure I gave the manuscript or parts of it to the ambassadors of the southern African countries, because their reaction to it would be critical.
Absolutely.
And about 3 of them from Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Angola gave it ringing endorsements and provided blurbs in the back of the book. So,
right. So is it your sense that it's likely to worsen diplomatic and political tensions between, for example, Nigeria and South Africa, and to deepen emotional passions, or will it lead to a better understanding and perhaps help to relieve those tensions?
Very good question. My hope is that it will help to relieve those tensions because it forces some of the conversations or discussions I have in that book is rough. I mean, it goes to the heart of the matter and doesn't try to play around.
Yes, I mean, I skimmed through the book, and
yes,
it certainly does hit the nail on the head,
indeed,
doesn't it?
And the idea is to shine the spotlight on the problem and not beat about it or allow the politicization of it, because a lot of it is a law and order issue that the government should come down very firmly on, and so on and so forth. So I hope that reading it would make the government and South African people, many of whom are not in support of what's happening, to say, you see, this is what we should do and fix it.
And what's the situation now with regard to that problem of xenophobia in South Africa? Has it effectively died down, or are there still eruptions of violence there?
I think it would be extraordinarily premature to think it's gone away, because some of the socioeconomic conditions that I think are the root of what causes the problem are still there. Horrible conditions for many of the black South Africans, living conditions and so on. And if you look at the history of how long it has been occurring, I mean, it started in earnest, in the worst form, in 2008. Some go back to 2006, but the real major one was 2008. And the last occurrence was 2018 or 17. So it's been a long while. So there's no saying that it will not occur again if the conditions are left the way they are and the government does not take decisive measures about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm just wondering how traumatic the reaction of South Africans has been to the presence of other Africans on their land. How traumatic has that been, not so much for the South Africans, but for the rest of the continent, particularly Nigeria, for instance, which stood solidly in support of black South Africans during those awful years of apartheid?
I think it must be terribly traumatic and confusing for Nigerians. That is not to say that there are no Nigerians in South Africa who are bad people, who do bad things, who break the laws and so forth. They're there. But like I say in the book, a couple of things. One, you have to establish through a proper court of law that they are actually criminals. You don't just say they are.
Absolutely.
As an excuse for mobs to go after them. That's one. Two, even if they are criminals, and some of them are illegal aliens or whatever the case may be, it still does not remove their human rights and due process and so forth and so on. So I believe that the South African government has failed woefully in the past and still failing to get a serious handle on that situation. It's not just Nigerians, Zimbabweans, their next door neighbors,
right.
Somalis, Ethiopians, and so on and so forth.
We'll come back and talk a bit more about that. Stay with us. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with my guest, Professor Emeka Aniagolu, who's written a new book that analyzes the history and socio-politics of apartheid, post-apartheid, and xenophobia in South Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now today we are reflecting on the souring relations between many African countries, including Nigeria and the Republic of South Africa, because of xenophobic attacks. My guest today, Professor Emeka Aniagolu, has written a new book, Rainbow Nation, a historical and socio-political analysis of the struggle against apartheid, as well as contemporary xenophobia in South Africa, which is being launched this Thursday here in Abuja. The foreword is written by President Olusegun Obasanjo, who was the head of state of Nigeria at the height of apartheid and who spearheaded Africa's fight against that racist system, in solidarity, of course, with black South Africans. Here he is as military leader of Nigeria in 1977, sending out a rallying call to Africans to stand up against apartheid.
We shall no longer just watch the racists of Pretoria devise improvements to their machinery of terror and repression. We should no longer just be outraged. We must act. In the words of my worthy predecessor, we cannot pretend that we are unaware of the machinations and conspiracy against our continent by not just the racists of South Africa, but even by those who pretend to be the friends of this continent, but whose sole interest is in what they can get out of us.
Olusegun Obasanjo in 1977 when he was military head of state of Nigeria. He, of course, subsequently became elected as civilian president between 1999 and 2007. And Professor Emeka Aniagolu, author of Rainbow Nation, A History and Socio-Political Analysis of South Africa, is still with me in the studio. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you.
So what do you think is behind that xenophobia and the extraordinarily vivid impact that we saw it have on many African foreigners in South Africa?
I think there are a number of factors. One is that the conditions, like I said, in which the vast majority of black South Africans are still living in are intolerable. They are very, very bad. And their governments have not been able to change things as quickly and as radically as everybody had hoped with the coming of the dismantling of apartheid. That's one. The other thing is, of course, precisely because of the geography of that situation, the closest people to them are black people, many of whom are immigrants, like most of the immigrants, African immigrants. There are not actually that many Nigerians in South Africa in absolute terms, but many of the ones that are the vast majority are Zimbabweans who can just come across the border, and they feel that the people are struggling for the same crumbs that they have. And my suspicion, and this is just my own insight as an author looking at this whole thing, is that their governments, particularly under the Zuma administration, has used that to deflect the wrath of the people against the government by giving them the impression these foreigners are somehow taking away things you're supposed to have. And of course, the land issue hasn't been resolved.
Absolutely.
As well, which was something a lot of people thought that with the end of apartheid, there would be maybe not exactly Zimbabwean style revolution of land, but that something would have been done far quicker than it has.
So based on that analysis that you just gave, do you think that South Africa remains and will remain a xenophobia hotspot for some time to come?
Not necessarily if there's a vigorous education program. I mean, I'm of the view that if books like this, and I'm not plugging it for myself, gotten into their school systems and so on, and used to educate a lot of people, they will begin to see things in a different way. And like I say, their media, particularly the television media, can be a very powerful way to change the way they're perceiving those so-called foreigners among them.
So let's take a big step back and you tell us how you think the Nigerian government reacted to that xenophobia challenge. Do you think they reacted in the right way to that crisis or not?
I personally don't think that the Nigerian government has reacted enough. I would say that under this current administration, this particular foreign minister has done some stuff in the case of Libya and the kind of upset he expressed over what happened in South Africa. But in terms of concrete policy that the government came up with, that if you do this to our nationals, we're going to do X.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid I've not been able to see it.
Basically, there were no consequences.
None that I can tell.
Right. And how much of a diplomatic price do you think South Africa has paid for all that xenophobia? Not necessarily just with Nigeria, but in terms of its relations with the African
I
countries.
think they paid a high price in terms of public relations. But I don't think there's been any real concrete consequences in terms of economic consequences and political consequences. Many countries where South African companies are doing business, they are still doing business there. I mean, there are close to 120-something South African companies in Nigeria alone. But there's not been any consequence, real material consequence, because of the xenophobia.
So why do you think there hasn't been a consequence?
Some of it is complex, and I don't know whether it's something I want to go into here, but I think it's a combination of factors. If a government, a host government, is aware and clear that a foreign government is not going to take lying low, mistreating its nationals, they will treat them differently. But if there is a feeling that the government is either impotent or not particularly bothered by it, or it's just going to be business as usual, there will be an inclination, not that the government of the host country will encourage it, but they will not do enough to try to stop it among their population.
Right.
Because in this case, the South African police is implicated in the xenophobia.
Could it be, though, and I wonder what your sense is, could it be that the South African government has strengthened its detection capacity to be able to detect when these problems are surfacing and to have prevention solutions that they can move out much more quickly and prevent any degeneration into violence? And they would have assured other African countries of that capacity that they've now put in place.
I don't know until something unfortunately happens and we see the way they react to it. The last incident, in fairness to the South African government, there was a much, much, much stronger and bigger show of police force, which lessened what could have been the outcome of that, which should be the standard practice whenever that happens. But to educate the population, to say what you think is the case, the stereotypes you've developed about it is not true, is a critical part of diffusing that type of thing.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating read. The book launch is on Thursday.
Tomorrow.
Tell us a bit about what's happening there and so on.
Well, we're going to have a cross-section of people. President Obasanjo was expected. We're still not sure if he's going to be able to make it or not because he had to come to Abuja for another meeting just a couple of days ago. And maybe he will come after all, but we're not so sure yet. But he's expected.
But he wrote the foreword to
Absolutely.
the book anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a cross-section of people, intellectuals, dignitaries, people from the National Assembly, et cetera, that are supposed to be there. My hope is that particularly the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Assembly, their members will come, purchase the book and read it, because there are some policy recommendations towards the end of the book about some of the issues you're talking about.
Okay. Professor Emeka Aniagolu, author of Rainbow Nation, a historical and socio-political analysis of South Africa. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And congratulations. Brilliant book.
Thank you.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including we'll cross to the Chadian capital N'Djamena for an update on pro-democracy protests there following a military takeover. Stay with us.